And welcome, students. As we dive into our next topic in programming, we're going to be getting into talking about some conditionals now. So the very first thing we're going to discuss is that of if-else statements. So if-else statements are what's part of known as branching statements. All right, just think about like a branch on a tree can fork to multiple different paths. This is the same kind of idea we're going to be looking at. So suppose you want to test a value of an object or variable to see if it's a certain value. Now, this is often accomplished using the branching statements using Boolean expressions. So true, false. Whether it's something that's true or something that's false is going to do one thing or the other. The most common branching statement, of course, is the if-else statement. If-else simply just chooses between two statements based upon the value of a Boolean expression. So, for example, you can check to see if a person has spent more than $12. Either they have spent more than $12 or they haven't spent more than $12. There's only two states there. It's a binary state. So let's look at another example. We're going to use a conditional to compute weekly salary for an hourly employee. So if we assume that overtime is time and a half, then the rate for overtime is rate times 40 plus 1.5 times rate times hours minus 40. However, if an employee works less than 40 hours, then the program should use the following: rate times hours. All right, because when you work overtime, it's typically time and a half. So that's why we want to calculate that differently. And now notice that there are two conditions here. If the employee works more than 40 hours, and if the employee works less than that. We can test this using an if-else statement as shown on our next slide here. So this is the if-else statement that would satisfy a condition. So if the number of hours are greater than 40, we're going to use pay is equal to rate times 40 plus 1.5 times rate times hours minus 40. Otherwise, we're going to say that the gross pay is just equal to rate times hours. That's it. It's that simple. Nothing super complicated. It's just simply just looking to say, hey, is this larger than this number or is it not larger than this number? That's all it is. All right, if we start looking at the arguments of an if-else, you'll notice that the Boolean expression is contained inside of parentheses. So if hours is greater than 40. This is what Java actually uses to test the code. So it's going to look what's inside those parentheses and it's going to say, is this true or is this false? And based upon that, it's going to act. So a Boolean expression can use any of the following operators. All right, now we're not necessarily going to get into all these today, but here's some of the ones that we have, such as a double ampersand is and, your two vertical bars or pipes are, or you have less than, greater than, less than or equal to, greater than, equal, not equal to, or equals to. Now you will notice, of course, that we don't have a keyboard symbol for what we usually use in math, where the line's underneath the symbol. So we just follow the equal sign afterwards. Not equal to, pretty self-explanatory. And we use a double equal sign here because remember, a single equal sign is used to assign a value. All right, so let's just do a quick recap of how if-else works. So conditionals are used to test whether certain conditions are met. This is typically done using if-else. All right, a good way to think of this is if this is true, then do this thing, else do this other thing. All right, that's a good way to think about it. You're going to test to see, hey, if this is true, I want to do something. Otherwise, if it's not true, I'm going to go do something else. Do not put a semicolon at the end of an if statement. All right, it can lead to syntax errors or even some cases, maybe even logic errors. You always want to use curly brackets. Now, there are kind of an exception where you can use, if it's just a single condition, you can put technically a semicolon there and Java will do it. However, the way I like to teach is to always use curly brackets because then you get in the habit of using it properly for multiple conditions and you don't have to worry about some weird exceptions. Now, as I just mentioned, you can technically omit if you have one line of code. It's best practice just to use the block statements with curly brackets. Now, one thing about if-else statements is that the else part of it is not always necessary. Those else blocks are not always needed. You could just simply test to see if something's true, and you don't care about what happens otherwise. So you're like, hey, I just want to see if the number is positive, for example. Okay, the number is positive. Great. I don't care about what it is when it's negative. I just want to know if it's positive. So I'm just going to know if x is greater than 0. All right, it's positive. Awesome. I'm just going to maybe output a statement that says x is positive. I don't necessarily need a statement that says x is negative because I don't need that for my program. All right, we don't need that else conditional every single time. Sometimes we only need the if. We're only going to be checking for that part. So if we don't need to do that, why write an else? It's just extra code that's going to be in our program. You can do this because you may only be interested in testing one condition and don't care about the other values. For example, as I kind of already alluded to, we can test things like, see if a count has reached 100. So let's say it's just a program that's just adding 1 every time. Well, you don't want to necessarily care about what the else is doing. We're only caring about the if part. So the else part could be omitted. So we're just going to say, hey, if x equals 100, stop the program. Beautiful, done. Now, while an else may not be needed, an if always is needed. All right, you always have to have the if part of your statement in there. So no matter what, when you're building these branching statements, these conditionals, you have to have an if. All right, so here's just another sample if else code. So here I have if x is less than 5, system.println, the value is less than 5. Else, system.println, the value is 5 or greater. And here's another example of one with no else. We have if x is greater than 5, x equals x plus 2, the system.println, the value of x is, and obviously 7. Now you will notice that here, remember this is a single line statement, and again I'm using curly brackets to encapsulate that. This still has a semicolon. We haven't changed that part, but right here around the ifs and the else parts, you'll notice that we use curly brackets. All right, and that's really handy when we start getting to multiple lines of code inside of those curly brackets. All right, compound statements is something we need to discuss. In our last example, the if block contained more than one line of code. This is what's called a compound statement. Now, generally when we have one or more lines of code, we'll follow the general syntax as follows. If Boolean expression, the yes statement, else, then the no statement. All right, and you'll notice that those are encapsulated within curly brackets. Now, the placement of your curly brackets does matter. You'll notice that sometimes code might be written like if x is less than 5, system.println, x is less than 5. Or it could be written as if x is less than 5, system.println, x is 5. You'll notice that this one, the difference is the curly brackets on the first line. This one, the curly brackets on the second line. Right? It doesn't really matter where you put that because they're both exactly the same code. They're just following different conventions. So which one you ultimately choose to use is up to you. So if you choose to use this first convention, perfectly acceptable. If you choose to use the second convention, that is also perfectly acceptable. Whichever one you want to do, it's fine. Just the important thing here is that you're consistent. So if you choose to do yours the first way, awesome, because that's perfectly acceptable. Just make sure that your entire program is going to be using that convention. If you're going to be using the second style, awesome again. Just make sure your entire program is using that convention. All right. A lot of times Eclipse, for example, will follow the first version, which is known as KR, and then the second version is more of an almond style. Those are the two people or two orgs that have generated those syntax styles. I'm more of a preference to using this simply because this generates one more line of code technically, so I like to condense stuff as much as possible. All right, and that's going to wrap up the notes, folks, on if-else statements. So when we come back next time, we will sink our teeth into them just a little bit more.